One wrong move, and the king would die. Israel had suffered under Moab for 18 years. But one man walked into the king's palace carrying a hidden blade. Then he asked to speak with the king alone. Ehud was a man from the tribe of Benjamin, the son of a man named Gera. He had grown up in a household where most boys were taught from childhood to strap their swords to the left side of their belt, training their right hand to draw fast and strike hard. But Ehud's strength had always lived in his left hand. And so as a boy, he had learned to do everything backward from the men around him, tying his sandals with his left fingers first, throwing stones with his left arm, lifting and carrying with the side of his body that others considered weak. No one around him ever thought much of it. It simply made him different, a small detail about a man that no one paid attention to. For 18 years, the land of Israel lived bent beneath the rule of Moab. King Eglon had grown strong, and every season the men of the villages gathered their grain into sacks, poured their oil into jars, and counted out silver that was no longer theirs to keep. Donkeys were loaded heavy at the start of the journey and led back home light and empty. Ehud watched this happen year after year, watched his neighbors hand over what they had worked the soil for, and he lived under that same weight like everyone else around him. But what he didn't know was that the very years he spent silently watching his people suffer were preparing him to become the one who would end it. The people of Israel finally lifted their voice and cried out to the Lord because of what King Eglon had done. And the Lord heard their cry and raised up Ehud to be their deliverer. Ehud rose early one morning and walked out to the small forge behind his home. He pulled a strip of raw iron from where it had been resting near the coals and laid it across the flat stone. He took up his hammer with his left hand and began to strike the metal again and again, turning it, flattening it, working the heat out of it slowly until the iron began to take shape. He worked through the heat of the day, stopping only to wipe the sweat from his brow, until at last he held in his hand a blade with two sharp edges, no longer than the length of his own forearm, light enough to be hidden, sharp enough to do what he intended. That evening, Ehud took a long strip of cloth and wound it tightly around his right thigh. He slid the blade beneath the wrapped cloth, adjusted it until it sat flat against his leg, and let his outer robe fall down over it. He walked a few steps across the room, turned, swung his arm the way a man might swing it, and felt nothing shift or catch beneath the fabric. He sat down, stood up again, bent low to pick something off the floor, and still the blade stayed hidden. The day came when the tribute was to be carried to King Eglon. Ehud walked out to where the donkeys were being loaded, checked the straps holding the sacks of grain in place, and tightened one that had come loose. He called out to the men gathered with him.
Men, the time has come. Let the tribute journey begin.
Yes, Ehud!
We are ready! Lift it steady now. Follow me.
They lifted the last of the silver onto the final donkey, and together the group set out from the village, walking down the dirt road that led out past the fields and toward the border. The road stretched on through dry hills and shallow valleys, the donkeys kicking up dust with every step, the sun climbing higher overhead as the day wore on, and continued on until, far in the distance, the walls of the Moabite palace began to rise up against the sky. As they drew closer, the gates of the city came into clear view, tall and guarded, with soldiers standing on either side watching every traveler who approached. When Ehud and his men reached the gates, the guards stepped forward and began searching each man before allowing him through, running their hands firmly along the left side of every traveler's body, feeling for the shape of a hidden blade. When it came to Ehud's turn, the guard ran his hands along his left hip, found nothing, and motioned him forward without a second glance. They were led through the courtyard and brought into the hall where King Eglon sat upon his throne, his body heavy and broad, his eyes following the donkeys as they were brought in one at a time. The sacks of grain were untied and poured out before him. The jars of oil were set down in a row. The silver was counted out and stacked at his feet. Eglon leaned forward, looking over the wealth being presented to him, nodding slowly with satisfaction at what his rule over a smaller nation continued to bring him. But what Eglon didn't know, sitting there counting his silver, was that the very tribute being laid out before his feet would be the last he would ever receive from anyone.
Before we continue, these videos takes hours and hours to make. If you could, please like and subscribe and comment which country you are watching this from.
When the last of the goods had been presented and counted, Ehud bowed before the king, turned, and led his men back out through the hall, through the courtyard, and out through the gates they had entered by. They walked back down the road the way they had come, the empty donkeys moving lighter and faster now. They walked on for some time, putting good distance between themselves and the palace walls, until Ehud finally slowed his pace and came to a stop. He turned to the men walking beside him and said, "Go on ahead without me. I have something left to finish here." The men looked at him for a moment, but did not question him further. They nodded, turned, and continued down the road together. Ehud stood in the road and watched them go until they grew small in the distance. And then he turned around and began walking back the way he had come, alone now. He reached the gates a second time that same day. The same guards who had searched him hours earlier stepped forward again, running their hands along his left side, just as they had before, finding nothing there and waving him through without suspicion. He walked through the courtyard, past the columns, until he came to the smaller chamber near the quarry of Gilgal, where King Eglon had withdrawn to rest in the cool of the afternoon. Ehud approached and bowed low before him. "I have a secret message for you, O king," he said quietly. Eglon lifted his hand and turned to the attendants standing near him. "Leave us," he commanded. The guards filed out one by one. The servants set down what they were carrying and stepped through the door. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, and the room fell into a thick silence, leaving only the king and Ehud standing together inside. Ehud stepped closer, lowering his voice further. "I have a message from God for you." Eglon began to rise from his throne, leaning forward, placing his weight onto his feet to stand and receive whatever word had been sent to him. In that same instant, Ehud's left hand moved fast, reaching beneath the folds of his robe, closing around the handle of the hidden blade. He drove it forward with full strength, the blade sinking deep into the king's body. Eglon's weight fell backward, and the blade sank in so far, the wound closing tightly around it, so that Ehud could not pull it free again, even if he had tried. He stepped back, turned, walked across the chamber to a side door that opened onto a porch, and stepped through it into the open air. He pulled the heavy door of the chamber shut behind him, took hold of the lock, and turned it firmly into place, sealing the room closed. He walked on across the porch and down the steps, moving back through the same halls he had passed through only moments before. He walked past the very guards who had let him through the gates twice that day. His pace slow and even, he passed through the courtyard, through the gates, and out onto the open road, the palace walls slowly falling behind him. Only once the walls had grown distant did he quicken his stride, moving faster now, putting one road behind him after another. He walked on through the lowlands as the sun began its slow drop toward the horizon, the ground beneath his feet beginning to rise the further he went, climbing higher into the hill country of Ephraim. He pressed on past rocky slopes and scattered trees, his legs aching from the distance already covered that day, until at last he reached a high ridge where the land spread out wide and visible below him in every direction. There, Ehud lifted a trumpet to his lips and blew it, the sound carrying far out across the valleys and hillsides. Men in the villages below lifted their heads at the sound, stepped out from their homes, and began climbing the slopes toward the high ridge where the call had come from. They gathered around him in growing numbers, more arriving with every passing moment, until a large crowd of Israelite men stood waiting before him.
Men of Israel, the time for action is now.
We are with you!
We will drive them from our land, for our freedom.
The men began moving down from the hills together, following close behind him as he led the way toward the Jordan River. They moved quickly across the lower ground, reaching the river before any word of what had happened in the palace could travel ahead of them. Ehud and his men spread out along the fords of the Jordan, the only crossings the fleeing Moabite soldiers could use to escape back to their own land. And they stood there waiting, weapons ready, watching the far side of the river. Back inside the palace, the guards stationed outside Eglon's locked chamber waited through the afternoon, assuming their king had simply chosen to rest alone behind the closed doors. But what those guards didn't know was that their king was already lying dead on the floor inside. Eventually, growing uneasy at the prolonged silence, the guards took hold of a key and forced the chamber doors open. They stepped inside and found their king lying still on the floor. Word of what had happened spread quickly through the palace and out into the surrounding camps, reaching the Moabite soldiers just as they began scrambling toward the river crossings to flee back toward their own territory. When the Moabite soldiers reached the fords of the Jordan, they found Ehud and the men of Israel already standing there, blocking every path across the water. The fighting that followed was fierce but did not last long. Israel struck down about 10,000 Moabite men that day along the banks of the river, strong and capable soldiers, every one of them. Yet not a single man among them managed to escape across to the other side. Moab was subdued under the hand of Israel that day, and the long years of carrying tribute across that border, the years of bowing before a foreign king's demands, came to an end. The fields of Israel were planted that season without fear of the harvest being carried away. The roads were walked without dread of Moabite soldiers waiting along them. For 80 years, the land remained at rest, one of the longest stretches of peace recorded in that age, the fruit of one quiet, left-handed man.